Did you hear of complaints about your office by the former special agent in charge of FBI office, Mr. Oswald?
The answer to your question, Senator, is no, and I was quite shocked when I saw the copy of that letter because my belief during the 1 year that Mr. Oswald was a special agent in charge of the Minneapolis Field Division, my perception was that we had a professional working relationship, so I was very surprised when that letter was submitted to the Senate.
In 2009, after you were confirmed by the Senate, did you remove the chief of the Narcotics and Violent Crime section of the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that was one of the allegations that Mr. Oswald made?
In 2009, when I became the U.S. Attorney for the second time, I spent the first month talking to every single Assistant United States Attorney in the office. I received several resignations from individuals who had been serving in supervisory roles, and as every new United States Attorney's prerogative is, I formed a leadership team that remains in place and has been very effective in helping move the district forward with the goals and objectives of both the district and the Department of Justice.
So did you remove the chief of the Narcotics and Violent Crime section of that office?
I made management changes when I came into office for the second time in August and September of 2009.
Did you remove that person?
Did I remove that person?
The chief of the Narcotics and Violent Crime section of the U.S. Attorney's Office.
I received the resignations of most of the supervisory AUSAs, as is a common practice when I became U.S. Attorney.
You did appoint a new chief to the section?
I did.
How did you know the individual you appointed as chief to the section?
How did I know them?
Know that person. To that section, the Narcotics and Violent Crime section.
I know many of the AUSAs. I have known over 20 years in that office. So I know individuals by reputation, and I know individuals personally.
Did she have previous management experience?
In terms of, who are you speaking of in particular, Senator? I don't want to engage in guesswork here. If the question is, did an individual that remains as our Narcotics and Violent Crime Chief, Assistant U.S. Attorney Carol Kaiser, have previous management experience, I believe the answer to that is yes. She's a very experienced prosecutor from the Northern District of Georgia, where she was an AUSA doing asset forfeiture. Before that, she was a DeKalb County state prosecutor in Georgia and was brought into the U.S. Attorney's Office prior to my arrival under the previous administration. And so she was very experienced and had some management experience before making her the Deputy Crim Chief for Narcotics and Violent Crime.
Go to Mr. Cruz.
I think it's Senator Schumer next, and then we'll go to Senator Cruz. I just want to follow up on one question since he was asking, Senator Grassley was asking about management of the office. Before you were U.S. Attorney, who was the U.S. Attorney before that?
There was a two-year period, nearly two-year period where Frank McGill, now Judge McGill, was the interim U.S. Attorney, but the prior presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed United States Attorney was Rachel Paulus.
And what happened to Rachel Paulus?
There was a period of challenges for the office, and eventually Ms. Paulus resigned as U.S. Attorney.
Mm-hmm. And she was appointed, was involved when I think Attorney General Gonzalez was in, and then one of the first acts, just to clarify the record, when Attorney General McCasey came in, was to actually call me. I just would like the record to reflect that, to get some names of people that could take over for an interim basis. So when you, and one of my suggestions was Mr. McGill, and so when you took over the office, it was only 2 years after this turmoil, as you've described it, which made the front page of many newspapers in the country. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Senator Schumer.
Well, thank you. First, I want to thank you, Director Jones, for your service both in the U.S. Attorney's Office and now as acting director of ATF. You've had a long, distinguished career. You were passed unanimously for U.S. Attorney by this committee a few years ago, and now, of course, it's taken a long time to get your nomination made, approved by this committee and by the Senate. So I'd like to first say that I think having a vacancy at this agency is a big mistake. Such an agency has to have leadership to provide direction to many employees who work here and keep Americans safe. So let me ask you this question. What would happen to the FBI without a director? Don't you think that that could be used by terrorists to say the United States is weak on terrorism, not doing all it could against terrorism if we had for years an acting director of the FBI? I do. I just want to know your opinion.
Well, it's sort of comparing apples to oranges because the FBI has always been part of the Department of Justice. It's only been 10 years since ATF has been part of the Department of Justice, and it's only been since 2006 that the director of ATF has been subject to Senate confirmation. So the analogs aren't quite right, but to your point, that continuity in leadership has been absolutely essential. When I left government service in 2001 and when I came back in 2009, knowing 9/11 happened in the interim, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was not the same organization that I knew when I left after serving as U.S. Attorney before. Much of that, and I've known Mr. Mueller for a long time, much of that is because they have continuous outstanding leadership over a long period of time, which has allowed things to structurally settle and for them to stay focused on those missions that are in their bailiwick.
Right. Look, it's my view having lack of an ATF director signals the same thing. We don't have the continuity, gun trafficking, crime, the kinds of things ATF does is vitally important, and it's not good to have a vacancy for so long, and I would hope that your confirmation would be moved. I'm not directing this at any particular person, but it's somehow it seems in agencies that people don't like what the agency does. NLRB, EPA, or D.C. Circuit. We somehow get vacancies there, and they're blocked for a very long period of time, and I would hope that would change. I would hope that would change. Your record's exemplary. And you were approved by this body unanimously as U.S. Attorney. And I would just hope we could move forward with you. I have a few specific questions. I know my time is running out. The Undetectable Firearms Act, this deals with 3D guns. It expires at the end of this year. First, I want to commend your agency working with TSA and Secret Service to keep us up to date on this. Now, when the law was passed, there were very few guns that could be brought undetected through a metal detector. Now that's changed. Aren't there guns that fire at least one shot that can successfully be brought through a metal detector? The gun itself, these 3D guns with plastic parts, by and large, just from what I understand, the only metal they'd need is a little spring, and that's not detectable in our metal detectors. Is that fair to say?
Our firearms technology branch, as you mentioned, Senator, working with Secret Service and with TSA and the FBI and other law enforcement organizations, is in the process of testing variations of the 3D gun and some other components that are somewhat troublesome. But the fundamental material for that, that being various grades of polymer, does make it undetectable without metal components.
So in light of this, do you think we have to reauthorize the Undetectable Firearms Act? And would your agency be prepared to submit some recommendations if any changes are needed?
We are always available to provide technical guidance and advice given our expertise. And I think that the evolving technology that underlies 3D printing on a variety of fronts certainly generates a sense of urgency, particularly since the Undetectable Firearms Act sunsets at the end of this year, for this body to examine this in the public safety context.
Well, once again, my time is expiring. I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank you for continuing under very difficult circumstances. And I want to thank you for your very calm demeanor in this hearing as well.
Thank you.
And we hope that continues. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Jones, thank you for being here. You are a currently sitting United States Attorney. You previously served as Chairman of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee. You're the Acting Director of ATF. You are perhaps uniquely situated to discuss the Obama administration's priorities and record concerning gun prosecution. So I'd like to ask you a question. Is it a priority for the Obama Justice Department to prosecute felons and fugitives who attempt to illegally purchase firearms?
Senator, thank you for that question. And one of the priorities of the Department of Justice has always been, during my second tenure as U.S. Attorney, protecting the American public from violent crime, including violent firearms crimes.
Is that a yes?
That's a yes.
Would you describe it as a high priority?
It is one of the major priorities.
So a major priority.
Yes.
I guess then I would ask you to reconcile that comment that it's a high priority with the data. And in particular, in 2010, out of 48,321 felons and fugitives who attempted to illegally purchase firearms, the Department of Justice prosecuted only 44 of them. 44 out of over 48,000. And at least for me, I have difficulty reconciling those hard facts with the assertion you have made that it is a high priority of the Obama Justice Department to prosecute felons and fugitives who try to illegally purchase firearms.
During fiscal year 2012, Senator, the Department of Justice did approximately 85,000 federal criminal cases involving defendants, and 1 out of 7 involved firearms offenses. The NICS check does generate hits of people who are potentially prohibited, and you are correct in that the number of folks who are prosecuted federally for what has been coined lying and trying is a small number. But the number does not tell the story about what the department has done with armed career criminals.
With respect, sir, my question wasn't about armed career criminals. My question was whether it was a priority to prosecute felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy firearms. Now, this data focuses exactly on that. That's why I wanted, you could have said, no, it's not a priority. And I would suggest the data demonstrate it is not a priority of the Obama Justice Department to prosecute felons and fugitives. In my view, that's completely unacceptable. Do you disagree? Do you think prosecuting just 44 out of over 48,000 felons and fugitives who tried to illegally buy guns, do you think that's an acceptable allocation of prosecutorial resources?
Prosecutorial resources are thin, and there are a number of issues that U.S. attorneys across the country deal with, ranging from national security, financial frauds, and we have tough decisions to make. The reality is, as a first-line prosecutor and someone who exercises their discretion on a regular basis, if given the choice between doing a lying and trying case, which we have not done in Minnesota, and doing an...
So your office has
we
done
have
zero
not done a lying and trying case.
Your office has prosecuted 0 felons and fugitives who tried to illegally purchase firearms?
We have not tried we have not prosecuted
Is that a
lying
yes?
and trying case. We have done over 150 felon in possession, armed career criminal cases. We have done straw purchaser cases. On the spectrum of prosecutions that U.S. attorneys can do, lying and trying cases, both because of the dedication of resources and the potential deterrent impact and the sentence that's going to be involved, are not commonly done, which is underlying that 44 figure that you cited earlier, Senator.
Mr. Jones, I have to admit I find it remarkable that you testified to this committee that it is a, quote, major priority of the Department of Justice to prosecute felons and fugitives who attempt to illegally purchase firearms, and that then you respond to this committee that it is an acceptable allocation of prosecutorial resources to prosecute just 44 out of over 48,000, and even more astonishingly, you inform this committee that you have prosecuted 0. My question to you is, are there other things you would describe as major priorities of the Department of Justice that at the same time you have chosen to prosecute 0 cases enforcing those so-called major priorities?
With all due respect, Senator, just so the record is clear, a major priority of this Department of Justice is protecting the American public from violent crime, including violent gun crime. I just want to make sure that that's clear so that what my testimony is not twisted into something that it's not. And your question, sir, was?
Are there any other so-called major priorities on which you have prosecuted 0 cases?
We've made hard decisions with our resources. Priority number 1 is national security. In Minnesota, we have made major efforts on that front with al-Shabaab. We have made major efforts on protecting our community from violent crime, including gun crime. We have made major efforts protecting the safety of people's nest eggs and financial fraud. And so we have a veritable smorgasbord of decisions that we're making, and all of our work has been consistent with the priorities of this Department of Justice.
Mr. Jones, I would note you chose not to answer my question. I just want to have one final question with the Chairman's indulgence, which is that the Grassley-Cruz legislation that was introduced on the floor of the Senate that received a majority of votes on the Senate, 52 senators, including 9 Democrats. It was the most bipartisan of all of the comprehensive gun legislation introduced. It provided funding for prosecuting felons and fugitives who attempt to illegally purchase firearms because, in my judgment and in the judgment of a majority of the Senate, it is utterly unacceptable for this Justice Department to refuse to prosecute felons and fugitives who attempt to illegally purchase firearms. In your role as acting director of the ATF or as U.S. Attorney, did you support the Grassley-Cruz legislation, and do you support that legislation?
Motion is agreed to. Any other senators wishing to change their vote? If not,
do any senators wish to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 60, the nays are 40. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. Under the previous order, all post-cloture time is expired. Question occurs on the Jones nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal.
now you can vote.
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carver. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Blake. Mr. Branken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. King. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson,
Did you get marked?
Mr. Paul, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer,
of confirmation.
Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Hall, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Chiesa, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Ms. Mikulski, aye.
Anyone wishing to vote or change their vote?
Anyone wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 53, the nays are 42.
The nomination is confirmed.
Nomination is confirmed.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to pre-morning business. The senators be allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each during this morning business hour.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that at 11 a.m. tomorrow morning, August 21st, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider nomination number 96. That there be 60 minutes for debate, equally divided in the usual form. The following the use reading back of that time, the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate on the nomination. The motion reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motion be in order, that any related statements be printed in the record, and that President Obama be notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Without objection.
The record should, I said tomorrow, but let's just make sure it's August 1st.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that tomorrow, August 1st, 2013, at 2 p.m., Senate consider executive session number 220, the Samantha Power nomination under the previous order.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that on Thursday, August 1st, that upon disposition of the Chen nomination and the resumption of the legislative session, Senate proceed to vote on the motion and vote cloture on S. 1243, the HUD appropriation bill, transportation HUD. Further, following the cloture vote, the Senate recess until 2 p.m. for the bipartisan caucus meeting we're having tomorrow.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that Senator Brown have two fellows on his staff, Andrew Steinwald and Catherine LeBeau, that they be granted floor privileges for tomorrow.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid on the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each. A senator from Iowa.
I would ask if I could speak for 12 minutes, as if in morning business.
Is there objection? Without objection.
They say that history has a way of repeating itself. That certainly came true in June when the Senate approved a sweeping reform bill to revamp the nation's immigration laws. Unfortunately, the U.S. Senate failed to learn from mistakes created in the 1986 overhaul. In the 1980s, about 3 million people who were living in this country illegally were granted legal status. Today, 27 years later, the U.S. estimates 11 million undocumented immigrants living here. What should that tell us? It says that the 1986 law failed to stem the flow of illegal immigration. It sent the wrong signal by granting legal status to millions while ignoring the need to secure the border. I don't need a crystal ball to tell me what would happen on the road ahead if we repeat the mistakes of the past. I saw how legalizing before securing our borders turned out. It turned America's time-honored welcome mat into a time-worn doormat. America's immigration system is broken. It's time to fix it so that a legal flow of immigration can help the economy and bolster areas of the workforce that are short of workers, from low-skilled to high-tech. But immigration laws should not come at the expense of American workers or cause them to be disadvantaged, displaced, or underpaid. Rooting out fraud and abuse from many of our visa programs should be a priority. Unfortunately, the bill passed by the United States Senate won't fix what's broken and is chock full of loopholes that make legalization far from ideal. Thankfully, our system of self-governance protects representation of, by, and for the people with a bicameral Congress. Now the U.S. House of Representatives has a chance to get it right. The House is moving on a number of bills They're having very thoughtful discussions on how to improve the legal system while adhering to the rule of law. They also know that passing one sweeping bill is a recipe for disaster, one that inevitably creates loopholes and allows special interest provisions to override good policy. So I'd discuss the House bill and its ideas, and some that I want to give some suggestions on. First, the House Judiciary Committee approved the SAFE Act, a bill that beefs up our interior enforcement efforts. It provides tools to state and local enforcement agencies to help the government enforce immigration laws. It enhances the 287G program, which I helped author. It gives the states and localities the power to enact and enforce their own immigration laws as long as they're consistent with federal law. The bill would improve our country's ability to remove criminal aliens. Dangerous individuals would be detained. Sex offenders would be made inadmissible, and gang members would be both inadmissible and deportable. These are provisions that are omitted from the Senate bill. Dangerous criminals are ignored in the Senate bill, and it was apparent that the other side of the aisle didn't want to have votes that would bar these dangerous criminals from receiving legal status. Securing the border is very important, but so is focusing on individuals who violate our laws, violate the terms of their stay in the United States. If we're serious about being tough on sex offenders, domestic abusers, drunk drivers, and other criminals, then the SAFE Act needs to be passed by the Senate, signed by the President. Second, the House Judiciary Committee approved a bill that improves the existing E-Verify program. This program is a valuable tool and should be made mandatory for all businesses. While the Senate bill does make it mandatory, it does so over 6 years and provides exceptions for certain employers. The House bill would implement the program on a faster timetable, which I have advocated. Third, the House Judiciary Committee approved bills that improve the legal system for Americans or for people who want to live and work in the United States. The committee approved a bill that focuses on high-skilled workers that are needed in the country, and another bill that improves the legal channels for people who want to work in agriculture. If we want to ensure that we don't deal with millions of people here illegally in the future, then we have to focus on getting our legal immigration system in order. Now I would talk about a border bill that was approved by the Committee on Homeland Security in the House. This is a bill that I'm not ready to endorse, and I'd explain why. The bill known as the Border Security Results Act is not a serious and comprehensive approach to border security. While it takes a good first step in requiring metrics to assess where the borders are secure, there's nothing that ensures that results are achieved. The bill requires Homeland Security within a 6-month enactment to develop a strategy on how to secure our borders. The strategy includes an assessment of threats along the border. It will take into consideration coordination of departments and cooperation of foreign countries. The strategy calls for an assessment of technology needed, but it doesn't actually do anything to give agents the resources they need. It does nothing to require fencing to be built. After the strategy is submitted to Congress, the Secretary develops an implementation plan and provides to Congress and the Government Accountability Office. But like the Senate bill, there's no repercussions if the Secretary doesn't actually submit a strategy, and there's no verification or approval of the strategy by the Congress. Instead, it relies on this and a future administration to make promises they won't keep. It relies on them to fulfill the law, but we've seen time and again that the administrations, not just of this administration, but too many, thumb their nose at bills that we send them. They not only refuse to implement laws they like, and in this case Obamacare is an example, but they'll refuse to carry out this immigration bill as well. Now, the bill requires the Secretary to develop metrics to measure the effectiveness of security at the ports and between ports of entry. That's a good start, but there are no consequences if the Secretary doesn't develop such metrics. The Government Accountability Office would evaluate the metrics, but again, there's no real consequences if they are flawed metrics, and the border still won't be secured. The Secretary then certifies that her department has achieved operational control. The definition of operational control is weakened from current law. The bill defines it as, quote, conditions in which there is not lower than 90% illegal border crossing effectiveness rate informed by situational awareness and a significant reduction in the movement of illicit drugs and other contraband through such areas. The Government Accountability Office would attest if certification for operational control is truly done. What if the Secretary never certifies this? What if the GAO says the Secretary's certification isn't accurate? If the Department fails to achieve control of the border, then they have to issue a report to explain why. Again, it lacks any true accountability for this or any future administration to actually secure the border. Finally, I want to mention one part of the House bill that is most concerning to me. During committee markup, an amendment in the House was accepted that would require a plan on the exit tracking system. And unfortunately, there's no beef to it. Implementation of a biometric exit system was a key point with the Senate considered immigration. The Congress has passed several laws that require executive branch to track entry and exit. Those mandates have been ignored. The airline industry resists, and instead of building upon current law and finding a way to make it happen, the House bill provides a way out if the exit system isn't deemed feasible by the Secretary, the same Secretary that has made no progress on the system. Border security is not only putting manpower and technology along the southern border, it's also about tracking people that enter this country. Given that 40% of our undocumented population consists of visa overstays, we must address this problem immediately. This problem is highlighted by a GAO report that was issued on Tuesday. GAO found that the Department has lost track of more than 1 million people. We know that they arrived in the United States. We don't know whether they've departed. By statute, the Department is required to report overstays. They claim they don't report the estimates because of lack of confidence that the data is reliable. After 17 years, the law has been ignored. The government isn't sophisticated enough to match incoming and outgoing travel records, and that's a serious risk to our national security. Over the years, the GAO has highlighted the challenges that the Department faces in putting the entry and exit system in place. Their new report casts more doubt on the Department's competency. When the Senate passed the immigration bill in June, I was very clear in suggesting that the bill would have to be fixed by a conference committee with the House, if we ever go to conference. With the exception of the border security bill, the House has presented some very valuable ideas. While I want an immigration reform bill sent to the President, I want it done right. We can take our time to get it right. Over the August recess, the American people will get their opportunity to inform members of Congress how they feel about immigration. But I can predict what many will say. I know from previous town meetings in my state, the people don't want more laws that will get ignored. They want laws that we have in place to actually be enforced. We need legislation that upholds Americans' values of hope, freedom, and opportunity. We need immigration laws in place that welcome law-abiding immigrants to share their entrepreneurial spirit, build better lives for themselves, and help make America a better place for generations to come. But we need legislation that upholds the rule of law and ensures that we don't saddle future generations with the same problems we're faced with today. It is my hope that Congress, over the August break, will listen to the American people and work to enact the reforms that achieves real results and make good on the promises made in Washington. I yield the floor.
President.